Kubernetes for Humans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Kubernetes for Human podcast. My name is Itiel Schwartz, and I'm your host today. Today, we have Sebastien with me on the show. Hey, Sebastien, please introduce yourself.
Hey, I am Sebastien Goasguen. I'm currently in Switzerland, and I've known Kubernetes almost since the beginning. So it should be fun.
So please tell, how did you start computer science? I guess it wasn't with Kubernetes, right? There was before Kubernetes, and how did you came that close to Kubernetes in its roots?
Yeah, so it's a great question because I think it's important to understand the history and the context of when new technologies comes into play. So we have to go back to 2013, 14 when Docker came about, right? So that was the start. That's when I really started looking at containers. But before that, my background was in computational science. So I'm actually not a computer scientist per se. Mm-hmm. I'm more of a electrical engineer, electromagnetics, circuit design, radars, things like this. And I got drawn into high performance computing, and then virtualization, right? So, at the time when Docker arrived, really everybody was working on virtualization and orchestration of virtual machines. Mm-hmm. OpenStack, CloudStack, Nvidia. Yeah. So that's a little bit of, how things started for me, at least.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then let's do a quick jump. Kubernetes, what? Yeah. Why? How?
Yeah, so the first big why was really when Docker arrived, so 10 years ago, right? So a lot of us in the industry were working on virtual machines. OpenStack was really, really big, and there were a few other smaller projects, Eucalyptus, CloudStack, Nvidia, Europe. And then suddenly Docker arrived, and everybody was talking about Docker. And I didn't really get it because we had Solaris zones and LXC containers, right? So the technology was there. I was like, why is Docker technology making such a noise and being such an appeal for developers? So I started looking at it. At the time, I was working at Citrix, and I started looking at containers. And I ended up writing the Docker cookbook for O'Reilly, right?
Oh,
that was a way for me to actually learn the technology and understand what was happening. And as soon as I tried Docker, I really loved it, right? Mm-hmm. So the availability of images in the Docker Hub, so really an app store, right? Mm-hmm. Docker pull, Docker push, that was great. With the registry, and then running an app was really simple, Docker run, right? Mm-hmm. So it felt definitely for a lot of developers, it felt much easier than installing packages on virtual machines and configuring them and so on. So the ease of use, the user experience, and the Docker Hub really made it so that everybody loved it, right? Mm-hmm. So that was the first big moment, right? Mm-hmm. But then there was a second moment.
And what was the second moment? What happened there?
Good. That was the question I was waiting for. Yeah. So the second moment was, I'd been working on high performance computing, large scale clusters, data centers. And I was like, okay, Docker is great for developers on your laptop, on your desktop. But when we're going to use this in production, in data centers, in clusters, we're going to need an orchestrator. We're going to need something to manage all those containers, right? And that's when, a year later, so 2014, June 2014, that's when Google announced the start of the Kubernetes project. Mm-hmm. So right away, I jumped on Kubernetes, and I think I probably I gave a talk on Kubernetes at a Docker meetup in Geneva. It must have been July 2014, something. And I was like, listen, Docker is great, but you're going to need Kubernetes to run, all those microservices in production. And then, so that was almost 10 years ago, and I've been in Kubernetes since then.
No, like I think it is quite amazing. Like they just like Kubernetes is it's really in the roots of Kubernetes. But back then Kubernetes wasn't like necessarily dominant to win, right? Like in those like days, there was also like Docker Swarm and Mesos, and like everyone, maybe even Nomad a bit later. So did you know that Kubernetes is going to win? What did you like about Kubernetes back in the day?
Yeah, so definitely there was other things. So Docker, Docker, the company, right away they also acknowledged that they were going to need something to run multiple containers in production. That gave rise to Docker Swarm. There was Mesos, which was there, even before. So there was a framework to run containers. I think Marathon, something like this.
Yeah, yes, there was
And then later Nomad, the folks who started Rancher, they started with their own orchestrator, which was called Cattle, right? So of course there were lots of other options. For me, really, what made it is that uh, I felt Kubernetes was easy to use, and I know we can argue about this, but I felt like the API, right, that Kubernetes gave you was easy to understand. It was a very clean, I always use this term, clean REST API, right? So it was a very clean REST API. At the time, you have to remember, it was kind of compared to like Amazon APIs, which were query-based. It was not really a very clean REST API. Suddenly you had, a very clean API that you could program, with in whatever language, right? Of course, at the time, there was no Python client or there was no very robust client, but at least you had a very nice API. The construct of, at the time, it was a replication controller, right? An RC, there was no deployment. So the replication controller was very nice to be able to control the number of replicas.
Yeah.
When your containers were failing, automatically you had this concept of a reconciliation loop, right? So there was something watching over the pods that would restart things. So there were really lots of very nice base constructs that were extremely powerful that I didn't find in Swarm, especially the first one, and then the second one, got even more complex. But that's why I was like, hey, Kubernetes is the thing, So I went for it. I didn't know it was going to be that big, of course, right? And, but
Wow.
the rest.
I think, by the way, I felt the same thing. Like I think like I worked a lot with like containers on bare metal EC2, right? Like, and then you need to figure out like a way to run it. And then all of a sudden, like I saw Kubernetes, and I felt like this is so logical, right? Like I don't need anything basically, and it just works. And I also like Docker Compose, which isn't like really production ready, but it gives you like a very nice wrapping, right? Around like how orchestrating multiple containers and network and volume can look like. I think like Compose had some promise in it. I don't know. I think Docker acquired them. Like they were not like really part of Docker like origin.
Yeah, look, Compose was of course very nice because a natural step after running a first container, very quickly you're like, hey, I actually need to run 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 containers, and I need some way to declare that my app is made of multiple services, right? So Compose made total sense, but I think if you look from the beginning, the appeal of Docker was really from the developer standpoint, right? The ease of use, the UX on the local machine, right? And Kubernetes was much more a backend system, right? So platform, if you wish, right? So it was very more of a platform to build upon. It was a platform for SREs, for backend.
Yeah.
And that's where, several years later, some friction started, appearing, because some developers were like, this is not for me. What is this? This is way too complicated. I was like, yes, but it's not for you. It's not a dev tool,
So let's deep dive into that. Like I couldn't agree more. Like I think again, and again, I will again mention Compose, because Compose always felt to me like dev oriented. Like they didn't care about how is it going to be production scale, super sophisticated reconciliation loop and whatever. Like I'm a developer. I want to run those two containers. I want them to have the same network, maybe one shared volume, and that's pretty much it. And you get it. Even now, 10 years later, running Kubernetes locally is not fun. I'm using, K3s. I'm using a Kind, which is Kubernetes in Docker, and I never have fun because it's very, very far from the normal development life cycle.
Yeah.
So I'll be happy, really let's deep dive into that. What and where do you see the main challenges, or back then or even now, of developers trying to use Kubernetes? What is the biggest problem? Where did you saw it, by the way? If you can share a bit about your what have you been up to in the last couple of years?
Yep.
And then let's talk about developers in Kubernetes and why it's not necessarily a match made in heaven, which I feel that for DevOps and SRE, Kubernetes is it's just much better than any technology I work with, which is it's really good. So it's like, yeah. So I let you answer.
No, that's fine. So, one of the first thing I did in the Kubernetes ecosystem was Compose with a Kompose. So Compose is still in the Kubernetes GitHub organization. You can find it github.com Kubernetes Compose.
Yeah.
And the idea there, my mindset was, developers are going to start with Docker on their machine. They're going to use Docker Compose. They're going to be happy with what they have running locally. And then they will want to move it to, a data center in the cloud, whatever, right? And for that, it will be running in Kubernetes. So we need some type of a translation layer from the local environment, which is Docker Compose, to Kubernetes manifest and Kubernetes APIs, right? Mm-hmm. So what Compose does is that it takes a Docker Compose file and it generates the Kubernetes manifest that corresponds.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time, that was really the thinking to be able to make that bridge, right, from local to remote in Kubernetes. Of course, as the ecosystem, grew and exploded, I mean, there is a spreadsheet somewhere of tools to manage Kubernetes application. And I think you get 150 of them. And then you get things like Helm and so on. So my point, I guess, is that I totally saw Docker Compose as something local. And then you would need a translation layer to go and talk and run in Kubernetes, right? The friction maybe happened because the ecosystem or the community didn't want to really how do you say give a winner in all the tools that were there for application management. So we have many application management tools for Kubernetes. And that gave rise to a bit of confusion, right? Why should I use this and not this one? And why? Oh, yeah, but I want that one as well. So suddenly you have so many tools that people get confused and developers get confused. And then ultimately you get that friction and that's where, you start having people saying, oh, I don't like this platform, right? So I don't know if I answered your question, correctly, but
I think you kind of did, but maybe share a bit about yourself. What have you been up to in the last couple of years, and how does it relate to Kubernetes?
Yeah. So, that's where you need really to understand the personas and who are the people using Kubernetes and what's happening. So, what we've seen a lot over the years is for example, SREs creating Helm templates, right, for an app that's running in their companies, right? And the developers, what they're doing, they're just committing code. It triggers the pipeline, rebuilds the images, and then it triggers an upgrade of a Helm package, right? So, that's a typical workflow that we see. And the developers of the apps or developers of the individual services, they barely touch Kubernetes, right? They don't have access to the API. They don't have access to the cluster. The only thing they do is that they code the app, and automatically the CI/CD pipeline generates new images. Trickles down. And I think that's the way it should be, right? Now, for me and my team at Trigermesh, we are building on top of Kubernetes. So the big interest for me from the beginning has been, at first it was called third-party resources, TPRs, all right? And with third-party resources, what you could do was actually create a new API endpoint in the Kubernetes API server, right? So, in the end, when it became stable, TPRs became custom resource definitions, CRDs.
Yep.
So everything we do at Trigermesh and everything I've done maybe the last 6-7 years has been writing Kubernetes controllers, right? And creating new API endpoints, new objects that are absolutely not made to be merged upstream, right? Because the entire thinking is that the core objects of Kubernetes are supposed to give you everything you need.
Yeah.
Then you can build on top of that. If you want a new object, you define it with a CRD. The API server is going to manage all the CRUD, right? Yep. And then you have to write your controllers that watches the endpoint and handles the creation, deletion, and whatever else needs to happen. So we write a lot of controllers to do event-based application. So where are my events coming from? Event sources. Where are my events going? An event destination, an event broker, a filter, a splitter. So all the constructs that we need to do an event-based application, for us, they are APIs, and we use Kubernetes to be able to basically implement those APIs.
So, you said one thing about what is the right level of abstraction when it comes to developer in Kubernetes, right? And your platform really utilize Kubernetes as an abstraction layer, right? It's something that no one should care other than the operation people, and the developer should basically know your platform, right? Or the wrapping around it. So I'll be happy to, if we can talk about this part a bit, because I think it's one of the most interesting things that we see both as a company, inside Commodore, and I see with customers, and also a lot of the guests of the podcast talk about this point quite a lot. So as it's one thing to create a magical pipeline with a CI/CD and good templates that will allow the developer to write his own code and not think about how it's going to trickle down to production. I think this is solvable. I already did those kind of things, and I think it's not that hard. Usually the problems, as we see, is more on the day two, when this application is having issues, or when this application all of a sudden now needs a volume or maybe a load balancer. And then sometimes you need to break this abstraction. And every time that you break this abstraction, when you tell the developer, hey, you need to see the logs of the pod, he's like, what is a pod? So far I lived in my own application, right? You didn't tell me it is called a pod. What do you want from me? And we see a lot of organizations struggle between the letting developers know everything, right? Volumes, pods, load balancer, network policy, whatever, on one hand. And on the other hand, developers shouldn't know anything other than their application. So, let's say I'm not using Trigermesh, even it's good. I'm not using it. And I'm using I'm building something myself, my own templating. Do you think developers should know or shouldn't know again, what is a pod, for example, or what is a replica set, and those kind of things?
So, that's where you have to take a step back, right? I think we're technologists. We like technology, and we like technology changing and new tech, right?
Yeah.
But if you're in a company and you have a very specific problem, very clear requirements, you really have to think about it and think about, hey, what's the easiest way to solve this, at the lowest cost,
Yeah.
right? And to be honest, even though I've been a big advocate of Kubernetes for the last 10 years, I'm like, if you can solve your problems with some plain old technology like, a VM with HTTPD and or Nginx and, a few bash scripts, go for it, right? I think as technologists, we have a tendency to try to push new tools, new tech in the hands of developers, right? And the big danger is that suddenly it becomes super complicated, right? I always refer to there was a blog some time back. I have to think about it. I think it was written, a fully ironical, blog, and I think it's something like it's simple, stupid, or something like this. And it's a conversation between two people where there's a developer someone who says, hey, I want to publish a web page, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the other person that arrives and say, oh, you need to use Docker, right?
Yeah.
And then you need to manage the fleet. And what's a fleet? Oh, a fleet, no problem. You use Core OS and it's an atomic, update operating system. What's an operating system? So the conversation goes on and on, where at the end you have one person that says, hey, you need a cloud-based load balancer, a fleet of VMs with a new OS, and so on. And what the first person wanted to do was just publish a web page, right? So, the first thing before even understanding abstractions and so on is really to step back and say, hey, what do I need to solve this problem? If in the end, what you need, you realize that what you need is Kubernetes, and it may be a question of scale. It may be because you have lots of users. It may be because you're managing a big data center. It may be security. You may have very valid reasons to use Kubernetes, but at the beginning, you shouldn't adopt it, from the get-go, just because, right?
Yeah. No, I think it makes sense. But I think for let's say I'm a large organization, right? Like I have 2,000 developers or something like that. I do need some standards from a ops perspective, because I don't want to run one VM, right? Like I need to manage it. There's cost question, optimization, and so on. So I need to create some shared infrastructure, and I will choose Kubernetes probably because everyone is using Kubernetes, right? And I do believe that if you are a large organization, I don't know anything which is much better to manage everything, right? If you need to manage the database and so on, and you want one clear place to learn everything. The database doesn't necessarily need to be in Kubernetes, but maybe you have a database team and you want to connect the database to Kubernetes, so you have to have some centralized system. But in that system, let's say again, the organization already said that it's going to use Kubernetes, right? So now the developers, should they know or shouldn't they know about the fact that the company use Kubernetes? In some organization, by the way, that I see, developers don't care about Kubernetes. There are the internal developer platform or whatever that allows them to abstract almost anything. But in those organizations, usually the NOC team is suffer much more, and the DevOps and SRE teams as well. So how do you see
we get back to the DevOps, kind of mindset, or the DevOps dilemma, right? And I always thought that the idea was that dev and ops were working hand in hand and understanding each other and being understanding each other problems and so on, and so that we would avoid silos, right? In the end, what I've seen actually is that maybe smaller organizations, but developers that are in charge of end user application, they don't want to know anything about the infrastructure and the management. They just want to write the application. So they're still very happy to kind of, instead of throwing a tarball, now they're throwing a Docker image, right? So the situation hasn't really improved. So you have to be extremely, extremely careful about this. At the same time, you cannot expect every developer to learn Kubernetes and the low level,
Yeah.
like a pod. What's a pod? And believe me, I've taught Kubernetes, a lot, right?
Yeah.
And when you have to explain, first you have to explain what's a container, then you have to explain what's a pod, and then a service, right? And this is hard, and for a lot of people, it's complicated. So you cannot expect to teach 2,000 developers, low level. They shouldn't touch the platform. So that's where you have that abstraction. What we've seen, a lot is, people build an additional DSL, people build Helm templates, or they expose a new API, right? And then, your 2,000 developers that just hit that new API, and the rest is hidden.
Yeah, but I think when it comes to like the new API, or at least like and we see it quite a lot in Condor, or from our customers, the new API works well when you build the things. Like once you have like the problems, the one API doesn't really cut it, like usually, and then like you can offboard like most of the issues, I will say, with like enough outsourcing or whatever. Maybe developers don't need to know everything, right? Like it is like a super valid point, but I do see like a lot of organizations struggle to find the right balance. Like sometimes they use Commodore, or sometimes they use other tools, right? Like, and in order to bridge it, but it does feel like it's not like entirely clear where should the balance be. I will say that if you look at something like Heroku, for example, like they try to create something which is like very dev friendly, right? Like you don't need to be an ops, but you still get all of those power. In the end of the day, like most of the industry is not running on Heroku, right? Like, or DigitalOcean, also on some aspects. But like I think it's quite interesting, right? Like I don't know where the futures lie, but I think it's like interesting.
But there's no, the book, The Mythical Man Month.
Well, yeah.
Right. So there was an annex to the second edition where, he said there's no silver bullet.
Yeah.
Right. And I really believe in this. There is absolutely no silver bullet. So there's not one solution that's going to fit everybody. Depending on the teams that you have, depending on the size of the team, depending on the culture, depending on the programming language that they like, right? One solution is going to be better than the others, right? So, some people are very JavaScript friendly, some people are very Go. Some people, maybe it's a one-man SRE team, one woman. So you don't know, right? So there's not, one size fits all. And that's the challenge. We would love to be able to give, one solution, right? One package, but I don't think it exists, right? The little bit related to this, I was talking to a friend at Magic Leap, that's using Kubernetes, and we were talking about how, the entire infrastructure has become so much complicated, right? Because if you adopt everything, so, Kubernetes, that's one thing, right? But then you have the logging, you have the monitoring, right? So Prometheus, whatnot. And then you're going to want to put maybe a service mesh to be able to, control your traffic and so on. And then you need to put some type of, governance with open policy, right? So you have all of this getting in the mix, plus your application management system, plus your CI/CD. It has become a really huge system or infrastructure with tons of moving pieces, right? And I think that's probably the biggest challenge right now is that a cloud native infrastructure, if you take the bits here and there, it's impossible to find, a couple people or a team that's going to be able to understand all the moving pieces and manage it and find the bugs and monitor it and so on, and then make the developers happy. The developers, at the end of the day, they want Heroku. They want a PaaS.
I agree. I agree. I agree. Like yeah, like why not? Like who cares about the underlying infra until you have to care. Like no one wants it as a developer. So like we are almost run out of time. Let's end with a prediction. Like give us a prediction. We'll check it in 3 years. Where is Commodore? Where is Kubernetes going to be 3 years from now?
Kubernetes 3 years from now.
To happen, right? Like you don't need to talk about everything. Emerging.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to talk about AI.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, you saw that there is a little tool called KNS AI or something like this, or KNS GPT, right?
By Alex Jones, I think. Yeah.
I think we have to look at AI helping SRE platform teams, managing the system, making sense of all the logs, all the monitoring. I'm not saying to abandon because it's so complex, but I think we have to think about machine learning, helping us manage microservices, apps, and so on. Especially with the ability to program, right? Because now we have things like Copilot, right? So you could imagine a system that says, oh, this service over there has a spike because of the traffic, blah, blah. I found the bug. I know where the code is. Let me submit a PR to fix the code. So I think we're gonna see lots of very interesting things.
Okay, super cool prediction. And we'll check again in 3 years. Sebastien, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, and good luck with Trigermesh.
Thank you. Thanks for detail. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Kubernetes for humans.